Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Oh, there's my cousin Lou.
Yes, sir. How you doing,
Carol,
cuz?
cousin Carol.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, guys. Can you guys hear the guitar?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
So guys, we want this to be interactive, but while we're not talking, if you could mute your microphones, that would really clear up the sound. Because we're going to have quite a few people. We're already up to 18. So if you could just mute your mic. And of course, anytime you want to speak, just feel free to unmute it. But just to reduce all the clicks and the clacks in all our households.
So, Bruce, I don't have like the names of people that are there. I can see some of them, but I guess that's not an issue.
Yeah, yeah, it's across the top. You can view them across the top. I see my friend Gilbert Garcia.
I see Gilbert. I see you.
Okay, well, it's 7 o'clock. Hey, Gilbert, it's 7 o'clock, so let's get started.
Okay.
I want to thank you guys for all showing up tonight to hear Micheal. You know, as you guys that know him, he loves to tell stories, and he's got some great ones. This is being sponsored by the New Mexico Jazz Workshop in conjunction with Jazz Appreciation Month. I'm going to encourage you to go over to our new website at some point, either after the meeting or at some point. And we've got a brand new website. It's very cool looking, very splashy. And there's a great spot for you to make donations. We are trying to keep the organization going strong as we try to bring music education to students here in New Mexico. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Micheal and let him get started. And Micheal, just why don't you start off by telling us how you got into music as a young man?
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank Bruce and the Jazz Workshop for asking me to do this, and also sending good wishes to Maud, hoping that she's recovering. She had surgery last week. She was the interim director until we had Bruce here, and a wonderful bassist who I played often with through the years. Well, I'll start, I'll back up a bit. And I started, well, I was in California. I moved from Brooklyn to California and started, I told my dad I heard Les Paul, and I heard Andre Segovia, and I heard Bo Diddley. I was a kid, I liked rock and roll. I liked all these things. And I just found out I just loved the guitar. And when I started to, and Django Reinhardt, when I started to take some lessons, Jimmy Weibel was my first guitar teacher. And the first thing he taught me was, Jimmy Weibel was an awesome guitarist. He did a lot of things on his own later on, but he played with Red Norvo. He taught me for about a year, and then he went on the road with Red Norvo. But the first thing he taught me on the guitar was to do a tremolo. You hear that? He taught me to do that. It was the first thing. Work on all the strings. And so that'll bring me to my first funny story, kind of. I'm gonna fast forward a bit and then come back again. A buddy of mine in LA was a wonderful guitarist. I won't mention names because these are kind of funny stories. He and I were working a job together once. We were doing a movie call together, and his family, they were all Italian guitar players. It was a family of guitar players, and they were wonderful players and wonderful sight readers, etc. Did a lot of studio work. But they weren't good at the tremolo. They couldn't tremolo very well. And that's good. Our joke was like, how can you be an Italian and not tremolo, right? You know, yeah. There's the old tremolo, or we could make a big deal out of it. see what I got. Anyway, so there's the idea. So we're doing this call, and then we're playing cues all day long, and we came across one cue where we both had like a duo thing to do, and we're sight reading, and he was a great sight reader. I was a good sight reader, but he was a great sight reader. So we're playing along, reading the cue, and at one point I kind of messed up, and he gives me a look, joking around, and so we keep playing along, and then we put that guitar down. We go on to the next couple of cues, and then we come up with a cue that's got tremolo. And he's sputtering. I'm not having a problem with the tremolo, but he's sputtering along, and so then I'm looking at him, and we're kind of laughing back and forth to each other, and we finish the cue, and he leans over to me finally, and he says, one of us can't read and the other guy can't tremolo. So between the two of us, we got this gig. Anyway, some of these things might be only funny to me, but at the time there's like history here. So that's the beginning, one of those things. Going all the way back again, I had neighbors, and when I first moved to California, they were a little older than me. I was an only child, and they took me under their wing. They'd take me out and take places. They gave me guitar records and things like that. And he told me, I was going to Van Nuys High School at the time. Marilyn Monroe went to Van Nuys High School about 8 years before me. But so he says, Michael, you need to think about, you're in high school now, you need to start thinking about what you want to be when you get out of high school, or your vocation when you get out of school. And so he says, I want you to think about that, and I'll ask you in a couple of months, So I was already hooked on the guitar. So he comes back and asks me a couple of months later, and he says, well, Michael, have you been thinking about what you want to be? And so his name was Bob, and his wife's name was Lorraine. And Lorraine and I shared a birthday together. And like I said, they were like older brother and sister to me. And so I said, yeah, Bob. And he said, well, what have you been thinking about? Now, Bob was a very academic, intellectual kind of guy. So he says, well, what are you thinking about? And I said, well, I want to be a guitar player. And I'm all bright-eyed and excited. And he says, oh, no, not a musician. You don't want to be a musician. And I says, yeah, I love the guitar. And he says, well, what kind of music do you like? And then I said, I want to be a jazz guitar player. And he just about hit the floor with that one. He's like, oh, boy, this guy's going to be a loser. So, and he was like really, really bugged about all of that. But he says, well, all right. And he gave me great advice. And he says, well, what guitar players do you listen to? And I says, well, I love Les Paul. I listen to Les Paul a lot. And he says, well, okay, well, somebody like Les Paul, if you're going to get that good, he says, these days, the guitar player was already the most popular instrument. It became so popular in 1950. We had Les Paul and Mary Ford. We had Bill Haley and the Comets. We had all kinds of great things going on with the guitar. Andre Segovia was exposing the world to classical guitar music. And so he says, people like Les Paul practiced 8 hours a day when they were younger. At some point in their life, you got to do that. So I took that to heart. And when I came up during high school, I had a job, and I worked at my uncle's restaurant, and was on the gym team, did all those things. But when I graduated that year, I spent the summer then practicing, developing an 8-hour schedule and working on that. So I took that to heart, and it paid off. I'll move along. So because there's a lot of things to share in an hour here, but I think I was telling Bruce the other day, the first time I tried to practice 8 hours, I ran through everything I knew in like an hour and a half. So I was like done, and I had to figure out how to do this. By the end of the summer, I was practicing 10 hours a day. So I would get up 8 o'clock in the morning, practice from 8 to 12. And then I would take a 2-hour break, go to the public swimming pool a couple of blocks away, have lunch, come back, and then practice from 2 to 6. And then by the end of the summer, then I take a dinner break, watch some TV, and then practice from 8 to 10. So there was a 10-hour day there. Then I didn't have enough hours because by now I was starting to learn songs. I was listening to records. I was doing all kinds of trying to learn to sight read, et cetera, learning different styles of playing. When you're a rhythm section player, you have to play a lot of different styles. You don't just play the notes on the page. Sometimes you do play just the notes on the page, but a lot of times you're setting the style. If you're a drummer, bass player, guitar player, pianist, you have to play set the style. Okay, so the next thing that happened was I started going to Valley College, and I wanted to major in music, and I passed the course, the test to be a major in music, and I'm practicing 8-10 hours a day, right? And they said, well, you did well on your test, but the guitar, I see you listed the guitar as your instrument. The guitar is not considered a legitimate instrument. Now we're talking like 1960 here. So what? The guitar is, how can the guitar not be a legitimate instrument? I was like furious because I'm doing all this work. And well, it just wasn't. And with all this going on, all these great players, Barney Kessel in the jazz world, etc., and all the other people I mentioned. So, okay, I had to bite the bullet and practice on my own. They did allow me to play in the jazz band, but I couldn't list the guitar as my instrument. But I could play I could play guitar in the jazz band. I then spent 2 years. I took 2 years of piano. And I played snare drum in the marching band. So that's what I did. And it did expand my horizons in that manner. But, you know, now full circle, I teach for the university here. Somebody can major in jazz guitar. I see somebody's on chat here. Okay, great. Being recorded. So onward, I'm listening to television. I'm watching television at this point, and the Perry Como show is very popular. And here's where I got the idea to be a studio guitarist, because, you know, my parents were very supportive. My dad, when he was small, he says when he was young, he was growing up in Cuba, and his dad wouldn't let him play guitar. So when I said I wanted to play the guitar, he was totally all for it. My mom was a little bit more aware of the world in this manner. And she says, are you sure you want to be a musician? Because, you know, musicians have a reputation. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. So, and I assured her that I was going to be good enough that I was going to do well. What did I know? But I just jumped in and went for it. But Perry Como had a great New York guitarist on his show, and his name was Tony Mottola. And he was a big New York studio guitarist, and he played the Perry Como show. And I think he was on staff at one of the main stations there. And that inspired me, because on all his shows, I saw Tony Mottola would accompany him at one point on his show, just Tony and the guitar. And I says, that's what I want to do. I want to do that because those guys make good money and they support their families and they don't have to travel a lot, etc. So that was one of the things that got me the idea of wanting to be a studio player. But then again, I would meet people like Tom Tedesco, who was the #1 studio player in LA. And he told me too, besides practicing, you got to learn to read the notes. You know, guitar players are terrible note readers for the most part, compared to the rest of the orchestra. So if you're going to be a studio player and play in an orchestra, you got to be able to do that. She says, put the coffee pot on and just read everything you can get your hands on. So I did all of those things. Coming down the road, I met Howard Roberts. Hi there. Further down the road, hey, along the way, if anybody has questions, just unmute and call out, okay? So I met my ultimate mentor, Howard Roberts, who was an awesome guitarist. He was jaw-dropping guitar player. He had the combination of, he was a great jazz player, which is what I wanted to become, but I also wanted to be able to put food on the table. So he was also a very successful studio player. And I started taking lessons from him, which were very fruitful down the road. He really put my playing together. He cleared up a lot of things that I was having technical problems with, et cetera, expanded my theory knowledge, along with I was going to college and taking musicianship and theory in college. But he helped me a lot with that. The day came, now I'm going to fast forward, the day came where he called me over to his house and he says, hey, Michael, when I used to go to his house often and hang out late at night, and he would be working on one of his albums and I'd play chords for him and do things like that. So one night I happened to be over there. No, I wasn't. This is prior. Not to this story yet. He calls me up one night and he says, what are you doing, Michael? And I said, nothing, Howard. He says, come on over. I want to give you an Uncle Howie talk. So I went over his house and he told me that he thought I was ready to work in the studios. But at this point, I was teaching like 50, 60 students a week. I was teaching a lot every day. That's how I was making a living, and playing casuals, what they called casuals, on the weekends, like parties and weddings and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and things like that. The LA guys cynically call them casualties, because usually there was always something that would go wrong on some of these jobs. But anyway, but that's how I was making my living at the time. But he says, look, he says, I think you're really ready to, if your goals are the same and you still want to be a studio player, but he says, you need to quit teaching all those students, because when you're finally going to get asked to play on a recording, it's going to be last minute, because they're not looking for the new guy. They want to hire all the old guys, and you're going to be replacing somebody that's sick last minute, and you're going to be called last minute, and you can't be saying, well, I got to teach a lesson now, I can't play, I can't do it, because that opportunity is not going to be coming around again. So I quit all 60 of my students, and come to find out, of course, at that point, my wife was expecting our first child, and so all of these things happened. I ended up going on the road a bit, but what happened was Howard started taking me around, hanging on to his coattails to his sessions that he was playing on. And this is how he got me started. I would be on a session with him, and he'd introduce me to the contractor and the composers, and he'd introduce me to the other musicians. And if there was other guitarists, he'd introduce me to other guitarists. So in the long run, I ended up starting to sub for other guitar players, and I'll elaborate on that in a minute. But here was the kicker. One day I went with Howard, and he was doing one of his albums. He did 11 albums for Capitol Records, and prior to that, he'd done some real jazz bebop records, but these were like jazz pop records, and and he did 11 of them for Capitol Records. So this one day, I would go with him to Capitol Records, and I'm all gleaming, because here I'm going to watch Howard do one of his own albums. The other dates he took me on were dates that he was in the orchestra, but it wasn't his feature. So I'm sitting in the booth, and the date's about to start. The well-known Carol Kay was on the session. She was playing bass. Earl Palmer was playing drums. Pete Jolly was playing organ. Pete and Howard grew up together in Phoenix. Pete was a marvelous musician. Larry Bunker was playing percussion. Some of you might know these names. And the accompanying guitar player was Billy Pittman. So I'm sitting in the booth, and suddenly I see Billy gets a phone call, and he goes up and starts talking to Howard. And then Howard looks over at me, and he waves me into the recording studio. So I start getting a little nervous, and I go in there, and he says, Micheal, have you got your guitar? And I said, yeah, I don't know what made me bring my guitar that day, but I did. I was in the trunk of my car, and he says, go get it. And it turned out that Billy Pittman had an emergency. And it's just exactly the way Howard told me it was going to happen. I'm just sitting there, and he said, yeah, Billy Pittman's son had appendicitis or something, being rushed to the hospital, and Billy had to leave the session before it even started. So there I am running out. It was a hot August day. I had this big heavy amplifier, my guitar, I'm carrying all this heavy stuff in there. My hands are shaking. and I end up playing on the session. They did 2 tunes that day. So, and that was the beginning. The producer was Dave Cavanaugh was his name. And again, I ended up working for him later on, doing some other sessions that he called me on his own for. But so I played on 2 tunes. One of them was an old tune called Coming Home Baby, and I had to play this, and I was sight reading, and it was in bass clef. Guitar players don't read bass clef. So anyway, that was the tune. It was originally made Mel Torme, of all people, had a big hit on it a few years earlier. So Howard was the name of Howard's album was called Great All-Time Instrumental Hits. You can Google it. The other tune on the album that we did that day, and I was just playing accompanying guitar on this. I didn't play the melody. Howard just ran all over the guitar and played just some amazing stuff. The other tune was a tune you might have heard. It was let's see. That was Wayne Newton. Anybody remember Wayne Newton? He had a big hit on this, and Howard was covering these hits. They called cover tunes. Let's see. Oh yeah, this was kind of like Mac the Knife. Then it did this. Change keys and it starts going up a key every chorus. So it's very much like Mac the Knife in that manner. So those are the two tunes they did that day, and I ended up playing on them. And that was one of my big beginnings on the on an official recording date. I had to fill out a form and the whole thing. So moving on. So I met Carol Kay on that date, and later on. I ended up getting called at the recording studio called Gold Star Records. That's where they did the Wrecking Crew, the noted Wrecking Crew, did a lot of recordings. And I ran into Carol Kay there again, and I was doing some of those sessions. Another one of these little quirky things that happened was I was the kid, right? I was pretty naive, a kid, very quiet and shy and the whole thing. So I'm on a recording at Gold Star Records. Phil Spector was a noted name that did a lot of those recordings that came out of Gold Star Records. He was a big producer at the time, produced a lot of huge hits. Anyway, so on one session I'm there and Carol Kay's sitting a few feet away from me, and hey, here's the kid again, you know. So we're playing and running through the music, and Carol drops her pencil or something, and I'm like all polite, and I reached over to pick up her pencil for her and help her with it. And of course she's kidding around, and as I'm reaching closer to her, she yells out, "Hey, fresh!" So I'm like totally embarrassed in front of the whole band. But she was kidding, and we got to be good friends later on. I ended up working a lot of sessions with her. So I would imagine some of you people out there have heard of Carol Kay. Another interesting thing that happened was after I'd met Barney Kessel. Barney was an awesome, great jazz guitarist, had a lot of albums of his own, did a lot of studio work in the earlier days, and I worked a session with him finally. These guys, I have their records, okay? I'm buying their records when I'm growing up, and suddenly I'm sitting next to them on a recording session. So I'm sitting next to Barney and showing him some things that I worked on and asking him some questions, picking his brain. And he was very, very nice to me, but he had a lesson for me. He says, you know, Mike, he says, when you're going to be doing studio work, there's only two things you need to know. Of course, we know that being a great player is just the beginning of it all. But he says you need to know just two things. And he says one is you need to memorize your social security number, because it was a freelance business. It was a freelance business, and you might have two sessions in one day or a different session every day. It was that busy when I was starting out. So anyway, he says, memorize your social security number, because you're working, you're going to be filling out W-4s every job you play. So he says, number one, you got to memorize your social security number. Number two, you got to know where to park. and which was true around LA, of course, in New York as well. But a lot of the studio work was done in LA, and yes, you had to learn where to park, because if you're at Capitol Records, they had a parking lot and you had to know where to go there to be close. And if you were at Universal Studios, then that was a different trip. If you were at MGM, or if you were at MGM, which was in Santa Monica, there was a different little trick to know about parking, about whatever studios you're in. So anyway, that was the little lesson he gave me that was rather humorous. Yeah, okay, so then I'm going to move on. Does anybody have a question at this point about anything? Because I'm going to breeze along here. Time goes by fast.
I have a
Well,
question, Michael.
yes.
What kind of money were you making back in those days?
Good
For
question.
a session, what would you get paid for a session?
Yeah, well, in those days, I was getting started. I worked in the recordings. I had a very fortunate career. I worked in the recording studios from the early 60s, and I left LA in 1980, the summer of 1980. So almost 20 years. So when I started out, a 3-hour session paid $63 and change. When I left, a 3-hour session paid $100. And then there were various scales depending on exactly what you were doing, and if you had any doubles, etc., which is going to bring me to my next thing. But like jingles paid, jingles were like a 1-hour call, maybe a 2-hour call, and the jingle paid around this, a little bit less than the $63. But when I started out, when I ended up, the jingle itself was about $90 for a 1-hour call. And so a 2-hour jingle was pretty good. Once again, the business was so booming when I started out, everybody was very busy, and there were at least 3, sometimes 4 guitars on one session. When I left, to give you an idea about how the business then started to change, when I left, then there was maybe 1 guitar on a session. So things started to change just before the 80s, in the arrival of the Moog synthesizer. Then there was some outsourcing that was starting to go on. So things like that did change the business later on. But I was very fortunate for all those years. So here, yes, I'll give you an idea of, there were 4 categories of jobs. And the 4 categories were recording work, movie work, TV shows, and jingles. Jingles were commercials, radio and television commercials. So there was that. And the instruments I had in my lineup were an electric guitar, an acoustic guitar, a 12-string guitar, banjo, a mandolin. I had 3 ukuleles. I had what was called a 6-string Dane Electro bass guitar. That was like a big guitar, but it was heavy strings and it was a bass. That was very popular in those days for movie calls, for getting that very low guitar sound. And also if anybody ever heard of Ray Conniff and Pete King, those guys had a certain style where the electric Dane electric bass guitar doubled the upright bass, and it produced a certain pop sound. So that was very popular in those days. And it was also used as a melodic instrument. The other instruments I had was an electric sitar. That put the sitar players out of business, unfortunately, but it was great. I used it a lot in my cartoon work, especially. I used it on the Carol Burnett Show and various places. I had my classical guitar and a bouzouki. I had all those instruments that I carried around with me. Later on, we had a cartage company, and we had trunks built, and they carried all our instruments for us. But at first, we carried those around in our trunks, So here's another way I got started then. I was again one night at Howard's house, and he gets a phone call while I'm sitting across from him, and he totally lies to get me on the job. And he tells the guy he couldn't work the next morning. He was being called for a jingle, and he says he's got the phone in his hand. This is before we had our cell phones, way long, and he puts the phone to his shoulder and he says, are you free tomorrow morning? As if, you know, I could be otherwise. And I said, sure. And he says, okay. And he gets on the phone and he tells the guy, he says, hey, have you heard of Mike Anthony? He's the new guy in town. And he's been, about the last 6 months, he's one of the busiest young guitar players now. And he's working all over town and he's a great player. He just totally lied. I wasn't doing anything. And so I ended up on the job. The guy, he says, he puts me on the phone with the composer. And I ended up the next morning, 10 o'clock at the place called the Annex. And I had a 1 hour jingle. And I had a few chords to play, and it was kind of a jazz job. I don't remember what it was, but I had to play a few jazz chords on the thing. And guess what? I heard that commercial and saw the commercial on TV. I heard it on radio and saw it on TV for about 7 years. So I got some royalties out of that, as well as the 1 hour fee scale. But anyway, there was Howard, trying to help me out and totally lying on my behalf. But I ended up working for that composer more down the road as well. So that's how things built. Another thing I used to do was a great guitarist, Herb Ellis. He was also another one of the great players. There was him and Barney Kessel, and I can't think of this other gentleman's name. There were three guys. They called themselves the Great Guitars, and they kind of got out of the studios after a while, and they did concertizing, and they played a lot of jazz concerts. But Herb, when he was still doing some studios, he did the Red Skelton Show. I don't know if any of you guys know that. So he would call me to end the show for him sometime. He'd have we used to call this dovetailing. If you weren't supposed to do this, but he would have to leave a little early to go to another starting job, another recording or something. And he called me in to play like the last half hour or 40 minutes for him. So this is the Red Skelton Show. And again, all these things I was watching when I was a kid. And suddenly I'm sitting following the direction of, trying to think of his name here, Holiday for Strings, David Rose. Okay, I grew up hearing that on TV. Anyway, it was that old theme, and I grew up hearing that Red Skelton's theme song. Here was the other little aside from that. That show was recorded at CBS Studio 33, which later became my alma mater with the Carol Burnett Show. Across from Sonny and Cher. The Sonny and Cher was across the way from us. Okay, so I'm going to move on. How I ended up then working for Burt Bacharach for a couple of 3 years, did some touring with him and did some recordings with him. So I'm leading up to how I got the Carol Burnett Show. Boy, time flies here. I would go to Lake Tahoe. We would do Las Vegas. We'd do that little circle around. But then I ended up playing on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. That was a big movie, which out of which Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head came out of. And BJ Thomas showed up one night. We did that recording at A&M Records. This was around 1967. I was now pretty established in the studios and doing the how shall I say, the good paying gigs, making a very good living. I'll give you an idea. At the peak of my career, I was doing maybe about 10 sessions a week, okay? Doing about 10 sessions a week, 10, sometimes 12. And then there was a time, now I'm remembering this, I didn't put it in my notes. There was a time when I ended up with 2 television shows. I was doing the Carol Burnett Show, and then Captain and Tennille had a summer show. They had a 10-week summer show, and I was fortunate to do that show. So now I had the Carol Burnett Show and the Captain and Tennille show going on. And then along with that, then later on came the Flintstones, and I was doing all of their work. But so I was doing, we were doing Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid. Raindrops came out of that big hit. That's 50 years ago. And thanks to the Musicians Union, the Los Angeles Musicians Union, I'm still getting an occasional royalty out of that because they still use that tune all over the place. And I'll get a few bucks here and there, even now, even like a few weeks ago. So here's how I ended up getting the Carol Burnett Show. I was doing a special for Burt Bacharach at NBC. I'll back up again. Another little cute aside here was one of the sessions, Billy Pittman, who was the guitar player on Howard's recording session that I ended up covering for, he and I later on did a lot of sessions together, and he and I worked on Butch Cassidy together. So we were the two guitarists, and there was a whole orchestra involved with that. So one night we show up and the cues are calling for 2 electric guitars. So I pulled my blue, I don't have this guitar anymore. I pulled out my blue, my metallic blue Stratocaster with the whammy bar, because I use that a lot for pop jobs and blues, etc. And he pulls out his Telecaster. So he sees my guitar and he says, "Wow, Mike," he says, "that's the guitar I always wanted." Well, I hated it because I love my jazz guitar. Pull this down a little bit here. Well, this is actually my Howard Roberts model, but I have a few like this, and these are thicker and they're more jazz oriented. But I used the solid body guitars for studio jobs, and because that got the pop sound perfectly. So he says, "That's the guitar I always wanted." And I looked at his guitar and I always liked the Telecaster. I said, "Well, that's the guitar I always wanted." And so we swapped on the gig. He went home with my blue Stratocaster and I went home with his Tele, and that was that. So yeah, I told him that story recently. He, by the way, he turned 100 years old last year, and he just recently turned 101 years old. He lives in Palm Springs now. He still remembers me if I call him, but he doesn't necessarily remember some of these stories at this point. But he's still in good health, and I went all the way out there to celebrate his 100th birthday with him. Okay, so we're doing now a Burt Bacharach's NBC special. And this is where I met Peter Matz. Peter Matz ended up being the conductor for the Carol Burnett Show, and Pete did some extra material. He was friends with Burt, and this is what they do in Hollywood. Composers hire other composers when they're so busy to kind of ghost write for them and write some extra material because they can't handle it all themselves. So Pete comes on and did some conducting for Burt and wrote some extra material. So I met Pete at this point. All right, another aside, Pete Matz. And I got to get to I have to get to Barbra Streisand here in a minute. Pete Matz wrote the iconic, if anybody's my age, arrangement on a tune called "People." Yeah. And it goes on. So "People" was a big hit, and it came from Funny Girl. And Jules Stein had written the tune. It's a gorgeous piece. So Pete had done that arrangement. He and Barbara were a couple in those earlier days. So now I'm going to come back to that in a little while. I meet Pete at the NBC special, and a month or two later, I get a call from Joe Saldo, who was the contractor and also a marvelous reed player. He calls me from New York and hires me to do the Carol Burnett Show. And the other odd thing here is that the big no-no I ended up doing is he calls me up, and the answering service, we had answering service. And they would call the answering service, and then the answering service would call you at home, and then you would take the job or speak with whoever wants to hire you. So he's on the phone from New York, and he says, "Hey, Mike Anthony, this is Joe Saldo. Do you remember me?" And I say, "What? No." I didn't remember him. That was so stupid. And he was nice enough to say, "Well, I was the contractor for the NBC special for Burt Bacharach. I met you there." Well, maybe he wasn't the contractor, but he came out and played it anyway. So anyway, I got the job, miraculously. And so that's how I got connected with the Carol Burnett Show, which I took on from 1970 through the last days, which was 1978. The show started in 1967 with the conductor Harry Zimmerman. He did those first 3 years. My wife was a dancer on the show in those first few years. And then when I came on is when we met, and we got together later because she was on the first year, and then she went away. She was doing the Ice Follies, the NBC Follies, no, the NBC Follies, and then she did some traveling with Sammy Davis Jr. as well. And she did the Dean Martin Show, so she was quite busy as a dancer in those days. Well, when she came back a few years later is when we got to know each other and developed a relationship in our life together. But yeah, that's how I got the Burnett Show, and it was very fortunate for me. There's a picture that I posted this last week that some of you might have seen of me with Ray Charles. Ray Charles was on the show once, and I was on stage with him, and so from that, Ray called me personally, and I went out to his recording studio and did some sessions for him, just overdubbing some things on the guitar. So you see how these things kind of network and weave around each other. He was an interesting guy to work for. It was very strange. I had played some sessions out there. He owned a studio called RPM. And it was out in Watts, Los Angeles area. And I would drive out there. Well, like I said, once was with a big band. And the few sessions I worked for him, everybody had a note about Ray, where he would start a session and he would say to you, well, he says, I never tell anybody how to play. And then he would tell you everything to play. So that was the nuance with regard to Ray. But he was very nice to me, and I did a few recordings for him, and I did some one-on-one with him. I went out. He called me at my house, and he said, "Can you come out to my studio next Tuesday?" And okay. And I read it in my book, and he would hire me personally, and I'd go out there and do some overdubbing for him. So that was a little bit of that. Across the way from the Carol Burnett Show was the Sonny and Cher show going on. So the guitar player that was playing for Sonny and Cher there was Lou Morrell, a wonderful player, and we all knew each other and covered for each other, and etc. We were all friendly competitors, so to speak. But Lou. I meant to say John Morrell. I don't know if I said Lou Morrell. I meant to say John Morrell. He was Lou's son. And John and I would cover for each other. He'd have a dress rehearsal over there and maybe wanted to take a picture call or something. And he said, can you cover for me across the way? I think he was at Studio 30. And I'm in 33. So I would go and cover for him, and then until he got there. And then there were days when I wanted to take a call out at Universal, a morning picture call or something, and I'd have him cover on the Burnett Show for me. So we did things like that for each other. We couldn't do that for the taping. On the Carol Burnett Show, what we did was I came in, my wife was there all week learning routines and things like that, and changing routines and learning the dance routines. The musicians, we showed up at 6:15 on Thursday night, 6:15, 6:30, and we did rehearsal and pre-record. Our production numbers were often like 1,000 bars, 800 to 1,000 bars. And so we would pre-record part of it so that we could make changes easier. So Thursday night, we would go in from about 6:30 to 9:30. And then we would go in at 11 o'clock on Friday morning, do a 3-hour dress rehearsal, and then we would have a couple of hours lunch, and then we would do 2 tapings. We'd do one at 4:15 and then one at 7 o'clock or 7:30, something like that. There would be a break in between. And that's what we did for the Burnett Show. And they took the best of both takes. So I'm covering some of the ground that I've been wanting to cover. I wanted to get to those things. I told you about my instruments, and I told you the job categories we had. Again, I had a very fortunate career. I was doing very, very well in these days. Any questions from anybody?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
What was something that one of these, whether it be Burt Bacharach or Ray Charles or some of these greats that you worked with, was there any advice or musical suggestions they gave you that you thought was very unique or interesting? You know, again, specifically to the music, you know, play a flat 5 in that spot or anything, you know, anything that was very insightful musically.
Uh, 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 Not specifically, but what I learned a lot from the composers, like from Pete Matz, I worked a lot with him, and I worked, well, I got to tell you a story about Lalo Schifrin here. Uh, uh, One of the things I learned a lot from the composers as I worked for them was I got harmony lessons. Even though I studied harmony in school and everything, I got harmony lessons by playing for these wonderful composers. So sometimes I would see, and composition lessons. Here I'm sitting at MGM Studios, or you know, these studios and these composers, and when I'm not playing, I'm listening to their masterful work. And I'm taking, so that was the kind of thing that I learned. I learned music. I got deeper in my musicianship because of being exposed and working for these marvelously talented composers. And their harmonic concept was expanded me. Sometimes Pete, we would do a lot of show tunes, and I would say, oh, gee, I know this song. It might be some regular song. Let's say, oh, it could be Blue Moon, you know. And he would find a way to reharmonize it. So I would get a harmony lesson. I would say, well, gee, I know the basic chords on that, but look how he's reharmonized it and created new colors. I got lessons like that constantly that expanded my ability to work out solos on the guitar.
Michael, Antonio Fernandez would like to know if you have an estimate on the number of recordings you've appeared on in your career.
Oh my God, what a question that is. I really just don't. Let's put it this way. If you put in about the early 60s, I had a few from the early 60s. I really took off around 1965. From that point on, if you figure that I did almost I averaged about 10 sessions a week, maybe do the math on that. So, however, it varied. There were times we had slow periods and things like that. But okay, let's just make it an average of 8 sessions a week. Let's put it that way to take in some of the slower periods. Yeah, I never even thought of it that way, but thanks for asking that. But I think if you put the math that way, you can come close. And that'll send me to the calculator later as well. I know I did over 600 recordings just for Hanna-Barbera alone, and that was the Flintstones. Hanna-Barbera did all the Saturday morning cartoons. I inherited that job from guitar. Yes. From the bass player buddy of mine, Steve Lefevre. He got me on that job, and he was playing the job already. Alan Roos was the guitar player. He was from the earlier days when he played with Tommy Dorsey, and he played with those early bands. So he was a good few years older than me, and he wanted to retire. And when he retired, I inherited that job with him. He did all of Disney's work as well. I ended up playing also on The Fox and the Hound for Walt Disney. I got some guitar solos on that movie as well. But all of Hanna-Barbera, all of the Saturday morning cartoons. Let me see here we go. Let's see if I can find some of this here. Flintstones. Hoyt Curtin wrote the tune. Steve Lefevre, Alan Roos got me on the job. Hoyt Curtin was one of the composers. Also, William Hanna and Joe Barbera wrote the song "The Flintstones." And it goes on. So it was a great tune. Jazz musicians, basically, if you're a musician out there, the progression was really 1-6-2-5 ad nauseum. And it did that forever. In the early days, they used to call that the "We Want Cantor" progression. We want Cantor, for Eddie Cantor. And but jazz musicians made it into a rhythm section, a rhythm changes song, the same changes as I've Got Rhythm, which is close. And then here it changes. So jazz musicians, because it had the same bridge as I've Got Rhythm. That's one of the unique things. When I play it in my group, I'll play the rhythm changes in E flat because the tune was in E flat. There's recording out there of Barney Kessel and Herb Ellis playing the Flintstones theme as a rhythm change, as an I've Got Rhythm tune, and they play it in B flat because musicians like to play that tune in B flat. Yeah, Hoyt Curtin was quite a character. He's a great guy and a great composer. He was a very funny guy. He was to show up at the date early, and he liked to jam. But the only key, now go figure this, the only key he could play in on the piano, he would sit at the piano, he would call a tune, he'd say, let's play Autumn Leaves in the key of F. And then he'd go, okay, let's play, all right, I Got Rhythm, F. And he would call any tune, he would call it an F, no matter what. He played everything in F on the piano. So for a composer, go figure, how could this possibly be? But we knew that. He used to like to play Sposen. That's right. He used to like to play I forget how it goes. But anyway, he used to like to call that F, everything in F. So, so whatever tunes we knew, we made sure we could play them in F so that he'd have some fun jamming a little bit. Okay, so moving on. Okay, I'm covering the Flintstones a bit here. I'm going to move on. I see the time is just wailing away here. I'm going to tell the story about Barbra Streisand. I'm going to back up now with Pete Matz and Barbra Streisand. I did several sessions with Barbra. Like I said, her and Pete were a couple in the early days. My unique kind of story about her here, and this is not negative, but it was a thing that one of her things that she had. I always got along great with her. There was another session I played with her once where my mentor, Howard Roberts, was on the session. He and I were playing it together. But I played Funny Lady with her. So she did a Funny Girl, right? And that's where the tune People came out. But Funny Lady was the sequel to that. I played on that. And during that taking, we did that out at Warner Brothers. Pete Matz did the music. Prior to this, she had a way of sort of, how shall I say, not unintentionally destroying composers. Okay, so I'm going to give you these three quick stories. I'm on a session once, and I can't remember his name, but it was Neil Diamond's conductor. He was traveling with Neil Diamond at the time, and I did a couple of sessions for him. And we were at the Western Studios in Hollywood, and it was a session for Barbra Streisand. Long story short, as we're playing, we run through the music and all of that, and she decides she doesn't like something in the arrangement. And before she's done, the whole arrangement's thrown out, and it just turns out to be voice and piano. And he just was beside himself, the poor guy. He was trying to accommodate. Well, I don't like this over here. And I went, oh, okay, well, then he's trying to change the music. And before you know it, the whole thing was just dismantled. Okay, that was that session. I'm telling very long stories very, very quickly so I can fill in my time here. All right, then there's another session. Now, if you can imagine this, the great Micheal Legrand. Is anybody out there? Hopefully you guys have heard of Micheal Legrand. The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Let me see here where my notes about Micheal. I toured with him with Andy Williams myself a couple of times. He was a great guy. He used to like to jam after the gig. Well, anyway, he wrote this great song. Watch what happens. Okay, it's a lovely song. I'm trying to think. He did other things. Oh, Summer of 42. He wrote the music for Summer of 42 and several other things. We're out at MGM Studios. And he wrote this elaborate arrangement for a full orchestra. There's 3 guitars on the session, myself, Tommy Tedesco, I think Dennis Buttermer was the other guitar player. And everybody's busy doing a bunch of stuff, and she hates it. this is Barbara Streisand. She hates the arrangement. This is Micheal Legrand, right? So we're in the studio and she goes up and she taps on him and she said, well, this, that, and he's trying to make her happy too. And then finally he gets furious. So again, I'm moving quickly here. They end up, there's this airway with these two thick doors that you go on out. You can go to the commissary and get coffee and things like that. They end up in the airlock screaming at each other for about, it seemed like 45 minutes. We're stuck in the recording studio, the whole orchestra, and we can't go anywhere because we had to go through that door. They're in there screaming at each other. And so we end up opening the exit, the fire exit, and stepping outside to get some fresh air while they're screaming at each other. It seemed like an eternity. Guess what? Once again, it turns out that the whole orchestra gets scrapped, and it turns out to be voice and piano. Again, this is Micheal Legrand, okay? This is ridiculous. Again, I toured with this guy, and he was a great, awesome composer, but he was very French, and he was very, very, how shall I say, everything was always very, very busy. His music was very, very busy, and it wasn't what she was hearing. Okay, now this is what I'm coming to. So now we're doing Funny Lady. And we're at Warner Brothers Studio, and Pete Matz is the composer and the conductor. They're an old couple. They're also both Jewish. They're like family. They're like brother and sister. So she shows up on the set with in the recording studio with her new flame, and who she later married and whatever. And they're kind of cavorting on the couch off in the side there. So, but in the middle of all this, we're rehearsing. We're going down some of the music that he composed. And she comes up to him and she tugs on him. Hey, Pete. And he said, he goes, what, Barbara? And he says, Pete, yeah, what do you want, Barbara? And so she says, Pete, I don't like that bell in there. And he says, Barbara, the bell's got to be there. Now go shut up and sit down. And she says, okay, Pete. And she goes and sits down. And then he hears her a little bit later on. She's again cavorting with her boyfriend. And he turns around and he says, Barbara, I'm trying to rehearse an orchestra here. Can you be quiet? Oh, Pete, I'm sorry. Sorry, Pete. This is the way she was with Pete. The other guy she destroyed. So that's my story. It was hilarious. I happened to be present for all of these sessions, you know. Another session I played with her, went very well. It wasn't like that at all. It was Neil Hefti, who was a great jazz composer. He did albums with Count Basie. I think it was one album called Basie Plays Hefty, all of his tunes. So anyway, we were at RCA Records, and I show up on the session, and my mentor is sitting next to me, Howard Roberts, the great Howard Roberts. And I get this, my part says, play some blues licks. The idea was she wanted somebody to play some blues licks, and then she would copy the blues lick, a couple of bars of blues, and then she would copy and sing it. So I've got it on my stand, and I'm like, Howard, you got to play. I mean, Howard was the ultimate, besides playing an awesome player, he's the ultimate blues player. And I said, Howard, you got to, this is for you. You play it. And he says, no, buddy, it's on your stand. You play it. And he sat there beaming like a proud papa. Hey, that's my student. That's my boy playing over there. So he was just proud as punch, just that I was doing it, and I got through it and went well, et cetera, et cetera. But there it was, that session for Barbara. We got along great, no problem. And she and my mentor is sitting right now, looking over my shoulder. So no pressure, Oh, moving on.
Michael?
Yes.
Michael, this is Gilbert.
Gilbert.
I think I have every one of your personal CDs. I love them all. My favorite is Amore.
Oh, thank you.
Seems to have a bit of both Italian flavor and salsa flavor, both.
Yeah, thank you.
And I love the CD you did with the lovely Diana Hughes.
Oh yes, I'm proud of that.
I was just kind of wondering, do you still tap dance anymore? I have seen you tap dance.
Oh God, Yeah, we still have our, well, my wife teaches the class, and we have what we call men's tap at our dance school, which is Fishback Studio. And it's been going on. I don't know how long men's tap's been around now, a good 15 years, but I do take her class every Wednesday night, and we got a bunch of thugs like me. And what happens mostly is that we all joking around. These guys have come on after work, and they've had a couple of cold ones, right? And everybody's telling jokes or whatever. And mostly we drive my poor wife Kathy nuts while she's trying to teach us something. But we have fun. We really have fun, and we get a conscience somewhere along the way. Say the poor lady's trying to teach us something, you know. But no, it's fun. I like the tapping the rhythms. I grew up when I was a kid. I saw all the Fred Astaire movies, Gene Kelly, the Nicholas Brothers. You know, I loved all that stuff. Tapping. I have no style at all, but I can tap the rhythms. And the Amore album was dedicated to my parents. The Spanish tunes were from my father, and the Italian tunes were from my mom. And by the way, while this comes up, my original, like as I mentioned, my father was Cuban. My original name was Michael Anthony Hernandez, so his name was Hernandez. My mother's maiden name was Lettieri. She was Italian, so I had both ends. So some people said, you were meant to be a guitar player. So
Michael, we have a question.
Yes.
Did you do many live sessions with some of, I guess the person's asking, which other great studio musicians did you work with in your career that stand out?
Oh boy, I worked with a lot of great musicians. How about Shelly Manne? Anybody know Shelly Manne, the great drummer? Ray Brown. Ray Brown used to call me the kid. Ray Brown. Thinking off the top of my head, there were all kinds of. Johnny Audino was an awesome lead trumpet player. I think he was on staff at NBC for a number of years. He played a lot of the shows there. Trying to think again off the top of my head. Did I say Shelly Manne? I think I did. Larry Bunker, he was a well-known player. Of course, Barney Kessel. Tommy Tedesco was like the number one. He was the guy, Tommy Tedesco was the one that took all of us under his wing. He took all the new guys under his wing, and he would help us out by booking us for, I met everybody from Howard. And I played with Joe Pass. He sat next to Joe Pass. He invited me to his house one time after we spent the morning at MGM together. And then I spent the afternoon at his house and got mostly hanging out with him and getting a free lesson, so to speak. But there were many, many wonderful musicians. I'm a little short on my quick memory about them, but I played with a lot of awesome. Warren Looney, I don't know if you knew him. He was a wonderful trumpet player. He and I went to college together, and he ended up playing the Carol Burnett Show. And at the same time, I think he was also doing the Lawrence Welk Show in the late 70s, mid 70s, whatever. There was a tune on Burt Bacharach called Edda's Theme, and I had witnessed many trumpet players really struggle on that particular chart in the time I was with them that had a very quiet low high A, or I think it was a high, I'm not sure if it was an I think it might have been a high A, and it was from the Butch Cassidy movie. Yeah, Edda's Theme. Edda was the female star in that movie. So anyway, Catherine Ross. But I've seen blood spilt in that part, and my good friend Warren Looney came along one day, and he played it like drinking a glass of water. And I swear, I got to tell you, I saw at least 4 or 5 trumpeters before him struggle with that part. Warren came on and played the heck out of it every time, to the point where Burt was looking at him. He couldn't believe it, because he knew most trumpet players had a problem with that. Okay, another great player that I played with there in the studios was from here, of course, the great Bobby Shew. Yeah, and he and I knew him when he first showed up, and he was the new kid on the block. And when I was going to move here, he came up to me one day. We were on a session together, and he says, "Hey, Mike, I hear you moving to Albuquerque, New Mexico." And I says, "Yeah." And he says, "That's my hometown." So, and he gave me a few names of musicians to call when I moved out here. And of course, since then, he and I stay in touch. And he and I played a group together. We called it the Charlie Christian the Charlie Christian Project, which Mickey Patton, who may be here tonight, put together. And he had me and Bobby playing, and and we had a drummer. So those are the
we're running short on time. We're actually over. But Antonio had another really good question, which was, what's the worst disaster you ever had on a session?
Everybody's had their turn at one, and I will tell you that one. I walked into Universal Studios one day, and there was a big 40-piece orchestra, and I couldn't play my part. And it started out with a classical guitar, about 21 bars, doubling the harp. And I remember this story was, it was, anybody remember the Marcus Welby series? It was the Doctor series. It was Marcus Welby. The composer conductor was Dick de Benedictus, if I remember this correctly. And so I was embarrassed because there's this whole 40-piece orchestra. I was established at this point, but he wrote out a thing. His knowledge of guitar was not expanded. Let's put it that way. So he wrote a piece where I'm doubling the harp, but he put it in B flat. So I always had to go down to this low B flat here, and I was doing okay with pretty good. In the middle of all this, I had to go down and get the B flat again. I can get it here, but every now and then, wherever I was, I had to get this B flat. And if we wrote it in A, it would not have been a problem. You know, I could hit the open A. Yeah. I could hit the low A and the low E, but he didn't know to put it in that key. He put it in B flat, and I got it close, but I would miss one note here or there or the other thing. And all the little tricks that Tommy Tedesco told me, leave a note out. I tried leaving a note out, and then he stopped the recording. Well, like I said, I only missed one note the first time, but then it went from bad to worse because then you get nervous, etc. And then he said, well, no, you can't leave a note out, Mike, because you're doubling the harp. And then you could hear that once somebody dropped out, you know. So he called me later on. I was very embarrassed. We got the take done, and he actually called me later on and apologized to me. He says, no, he says we were able to piece it together, and I apologize, I didn't put it in a better key for you. He was very kind composer. And then Tommy Tedesco was coming in for the afternoon session, and he took me to lunch, and he says, what's wrong with you? And he says, oh man, I messed up. And he takes me to lunch, and then he told me about the time he couldn't play his part. So everybody has had their turn where they've had their headaches, you know, but that was my time. And it was in the key of B flat, where he could have written it in A, and I could have had the open A there, but I had to keep running down to get the B flat.
Right. Well, guys, we are out of time. I wanted to thank all of you guys for coming. I want to encourage you to join next week. We're going to have Micah Hood talking about jazz and how to listen to jazz, something we can all use some experience with. I want to encourage you to go over to nmjazz.org, our website, where you can make a donation. Remember, all the money that you donate goes to help our efforts to bring music education to Albuquerque area children. I want to thank Micheal so much for such a great 1 hour.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, folks, for showing up and for listening. And again, I thank the workshop and Maud, who originally had asked me, and my meetings with you, Bruce. It's great to have you on board. You're doing a wonderful job.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. We'll see you next week. And oh yeah, by the way, keep an eye out because we did some special recordings with some jazz groups, and you're going to see some announcements where you can go and watch those. We recorded Bert Dalton last week, and you're going to see it online here in the next 24. Actually, it might be on tonight even. But it's a wonderful show, great jazz. I know we're all jonesing to hear some more jazz, so it's out there. Thank you guys for coming. We'll see you again next time, okay?
Good night, Cousin Carol. Good night, Cousin Lou. Good night, Carol. Students, friends, music lovers, and Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mike. See you, cuz.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks, Gran. Good night.